Tonight, we're going to explore a question you've probably never asked yourself. It's one of those things hiding in plain sight, invisible precisely because it's so ordinary. Walk into any grocery store, any restaurant, any kitchen in the world, and you'll find meat, beef, pork, chicken, lamb, fish, the staples of countless cuisines, the centerpieces of family dinners, the proteins that have fueled human civilization for thousands of years. But here's what you won't find: lion steaks, tiger burgers, wolf chops, bear roasts, unless you're in a very specific part of the world, leopard sausages, hyena jerky. The flesh of carnivorous animals is conspicuously absent from our plates. And when you really think about it, that's strange. Because humans eat an astonishing variety of living things. We've consumed everything from insects to whales, from seaweed to bird's nest soup. We're omnivores with adventurous palates and remarkable adaptability. And yet, when it comes to the meat eaters of the animal kingdom, we've drawn an invisible line. Why? The answer isn't as simple as you might think. It's not just one thing. It's not purely biological or cultural or economic. It's a knot of interconnected reasons, each thread pulling on the others, creating a pattern that emerges across virtually every human society that has ever existed. And tonight, we're going to untangle that knot, strand by strand, until we understand why your ancestors and mine, and those of nearly every person who has ever lived, looked at a predator and thought, not food. If you enjoy learning about ancient history while you go to sleep, you would be supporting me tremendously by liking the video and subscribing. So thank you. Now back to the video. Let's start with observation. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a farm. Any farm, anywhere in the world. What animals do you see? Probably cows, placidly chewing grass in a green field. Maybe pigs rooting around in the mud. Chickens pecking at the ground. Sheep dotting a hillside. Goats climbing on things they probably shouldn't climb on. Maybe horses, though we tend to have complicated feelings about eating those, at least in some cultures. Now picture a zoo. What do you see there? Lions behind glass, tigers pacing their enclosures, bears lounging in constructed habitats, wolves moving as a pack, crocodiles sunning themselves beside pools. These animals are displayed, observed, sometimes feared, often admired. But they are not farmed. They are not raised for meat. They are not, in the vast majority of human history and geography, considered food. This distinction isn't random, it's not arbitrary, and it's not new. When archaeologists excavate ancient settlements, they find the bones of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, the bones of deer and rabbits hunted in the wild, the remnants of fish and shellfish, but the bones of large carnivores, when they appear at all, tell different stories. They show signs of being killed, yes, but often for pelts, not for food. Their bones bear cut marks, but in different patterns than the food animals, suggesting that ancient humans were interested in their skins, their teeth, their claws, not necessarily their meat. There are exceptions, of course. There are always exceptions. In some Arctic communities, polar bears have been hunted and eaten for thousands of years, though even there, specific preparation methods are required, specific parts are preferred, and the practice is as much about survival in an extreme environment as it is about dietary choice. In some parts of the world, bear paws are considered a delicacy. In others, certain carnivorous fish are prized for their rich flavor. But these exceptions actually prove the rule. They're notable precisely because they're unusual. They require explanation, cultural context, special circumstances. The universal preference. Across the globe, across time, humans have shown a remarkably consistent preference for eating herbivores and omnivores. This preference transcends culture, religion, geography, and historical period. Ancient Romans, medieval Europeans, indigenous Americans, Asian emperors, African tribes, Pacific Islanders, they all showed the same basic pattern. When it came time to decide what's for dinner, predators rarely made the cut. Think about the animals that have fed the greatest number of humans throughout history. Cattle, descended from the aurochs, domesticated around 10,000 years ago. Pigs, domesticated around the same time. Omnivores who could eat almost anything but thrived on plant-based diets, supplemented with scraps. Chickens, domesticated from jungle fowl in Southeast Asia, eating seeds and insects. Sheep and goats, among the first animals ever domesticated, perfectly adapted to convert grass and scrub into meat and milk. These animals share something crucial. They don't primarily eat other animals. Even when we look at hunted game, the pattern holds. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, various species of birds. These are the traditional targets of hunters. Yes, hunters might kill a wolf or a bear, but usually for different reasons. Protection, sport, the pelt, the trophy. Eating the meat was often secondary, sometimes avoided entirely. And when it did happen, it was usually done with caution. The question deepens. So we're left with our question, sharpened now by observation. Why? What is it about carnivores that makes them such universally unappealing dinner options? The easy answer, the one that probably springs to mind first, is danger. Carnivores are dangerous. They have sharp teeth and claws. They're strong, fast, aggressive. Hunting a lion is considerably more perilous than hunting a deer. True enough, but humans have never been particularly deterred by danger when there's something we want. We've hunted whales from tiny boats. We've pursued mammoths armed with nothing but stone-tipped spears. We've risked our lives for honey, for bird eggs perched on impossible cliffs, for fish in stormy seas. Danger has never stopped us when the reward was worth it. And besides, we do kill large carnivores. We have throughout history. We've hunted lions, bears, wolves, crocodiles. We've fought them, feared them, driven them to extinction in some regions. We've proven perfectly capable of killing them. We just don't eat them. Or rather, we don't eat them with the same enthusiasm, the same consistency, the same culinary creativity that we bring to eating cattle, pigs, and chickens. So it's not just danger. There's something else going on. Something deeper, something woven into the fabric of ecology, biology, chemistry, and culture. The theories begin. Over the years, scientists, anthropologists, ecologists, and evolutionary biologists have proposed various explanations. Let's lay them out, like pieces of a puzzle, before we start fitting them together. First, there's the energy efficiency argument. This one comes from ecology, from the study of how energy moves through ecosystems. The basic idea is simple. Raising carnivores for food is wasteful. It takes more resources to produce a pound of carnivore meat than a pound of herbivore meat, by a significant margin. We'll explore exactly why in detail, but the core concept is about energy transfer, about the loss that occurs at each step of the food chain. Second, there's the bioaccumulation hypothesis. This one is about toxins, about the dangerous substances that build up in the bodies of predators who have spent their lives eating other animals, who have spent their lives eating plants that absorb things from the soil and water. Mercury, heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, these don't just disappear. They concentrate, accumulate, magnify as they move up the food chain. Eating something at the top of that chain means eating everything it ate, and everything those things ate, all the way down. Third, there's the taste and texture problem. Carnivore meat, according to those who've tried it, often doesn't taste particularly good. It's lean, tough, sometimes described as gamey or unpleasant. The reasons for this are biological, having to do with muscle composition, fat content, and the chemistry of meat flavor. We've evolved preferences for tender, fatty meat, the kind that comes from animals who spend their days grazing, not chasing. Fourth, there's the cultural and religious dimension. Many religious traditions explicitly forbid the consumption of carnivorous animals. Jewish dietary laws, Islamic halal requirements, various other religious codes all include prohibitions on eating predators. These rules didn't emerge in a vacuum. They reflect, encode, and reinforce practical wisdom about what's safe, healthy, and culturally appropriate to eat. Fifth, there's the simple practical matter of domestication. We can't easily raise carnivores the way we raise cattle. Try to imagine a carnivore farm. What do you feed a barn? Full of lions, other animals, lots of them. The logistics collapse almost immediately. Herbivores convert plants, a renewable and abundant resource, into meat. Carnivores convert other animals into meat. The math doesn't work. The economics don't work. The practicality doesn't work. These theories aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they're deeply interconnected, each reinforcing the others. The energy inefficiency contributes to the impracticality of domestication. The bioaccumulation creates health risks that may have influenced religious prohibitions. The taste problem might be linked to the very adaptations that make carnivores good at hunting. Together, they form a comprehensive explanation, a multi-layered answer to our question. The structure of what follows. Tonight, we're going to examine each of these theories in depth. We'll start with the ecology, with energy and trophic levels, and the mathematics of food chains. We'll see exactly why, from a pure energy standpoint, eating carnivores is inefficient. Then we'll dive into the chemistry, into bioaccumulation and biomagnification, into mercury and PCBs, and all the things that lurk in the tissues of top predators. We'll understand why eating a tuna is different from eating a lion, even though both are carnivores. We'll explore the biology of meat, the proteins and compounds that give it flavor and texture, and why the meat of predators differs from the meat of prey in ways your taste buds can detect. We'll look back in time to archaeological sites where our ancestors left clues about what they ate and didn't eat, where they hunted bears but seemed reluctant to feast on them. We'll examine the cultural evolution of food taboos, how religious laws codified practical wisdom, how certain animals became permissible while others became forbidden. We'll consider the history of domestication, why humans successfully tamed aurochs and wild boars, but never managed to create farms full of tame tigers. And we'll look at the exceptions, the edge cases, the times and places where humans did and do eat carnivores, and what those exceptions teach us about the rule. By the end, you'll understand that the absence of carnivore meat from your dinner plate isn't an accident. It's not arbitrary. It's the result of 10,000 years of human experimentation, of trial and error, of ecological constraints and biological realities and cultural learning. It's a pattern that emerged independently in societies around the world because it reflects something fundamental about how energy flows through ecosystems, how toxins accumulate in food chains, and how human taste preferences evolved in response to these realities. A note on perspective. Before we begin, it's worth acknowledging that this is, in many ways, a story about human exceptionalism. We're going to talk about why humans don't eat carnivores, but of course, the question presupposes that we have a choice. Many animals don't have that luxury. They eat what they can catch, what they can digest, what's available. A lion doesn't choose to eat zebras over hyenas because of energy efficiency calculations. It eats what it can kill and what its digestive system can process. But humans are different. We're omnivores with remarkable flexibility. We can eat an extraordinary range of foods, from the most fibrous plants to the fattiest meats. We can survive on diets that would kill other species. We can adapt to environments from the Arctic to the tropics. We have the capacity for choice, for culture, for learning and passing down knowledge about what to eat and what to avoid. That capacity for choice is what makes the question interesting. We could eat carnivores. Anatomically, physiologically, we're capable of it. Some people do, in specific contexts, but we generally don't. And understanding why tells us something important, not just about carnivores, but about ourselves, about how we think about food, about risk, about efficiency and culture and tradition, about how we've shaped the world around us and how that world has shaped us in return. So let's begin. Let's start at the most fundamental level, with energy itself, with the physics and ecology that govern what eats what and why. Let's talk about food chains, about trophic levels, about the 10% rule that explains why there are no carnivore farms and why you've never seen a lion burger on a menu. Because before we can understand the chemistry, the culture, the history, we need to understand the energy. And once we do, everything else will start to make sense. The invisible architecture food chains are invisible. You can't see energy flowing from grass to grasshopper to bird. You can't watch with your naked eye as sunlight gets converted into plant matter into insect protein into bird flesh. It happens constantly, everywhere, all around us. But it's not visible the way a tree is visible, or a river. Yet this invisible architecture determines everything. It determines which animals can exist, in what numbers, in what places. It determines the shape of ecosystems, the rise and fall of species, the success and failure of hunting strategies, farming practices, and yes, dietary choices. Ecologists call these layers trophic levels. The word comes from Greek, trophy, meaning food. Each trophic level represents a step in the transfer of energy from the sun to living things. At the bottom, you have primary producers, plants, algae, organisms that can capture energy directly from sunlight through photosynthesis. They convert solar energy into chemical energy, building sugars and starches and cellulose out of carbon dioxide, water, and light. Above them, you have primary consumers, herbivores, animals that eat plants, grasshoppers, caterpillars, deer, elephants, cattle. They eat the primary producers and convert that plant energy into animal tissue. Above them, you have secondary consumers, carnivores that eat herbivores, frogs that eat grasshoppers, wolves that eat deer, humans who eat cattle. These animals are converting the energy stored in herbivore tissue into predator tissue. And above them, in some ecosystems, you have tertiary consumers, carnivores that eat other carnivores, eagles that eat snakes that eat frogs, killer whales that eat seals that eat fish. These are the apex predators, the animals at the very top of the food chain. This structure seems simple, it seems orderly, and in diagrams it looks neat and efficient. But here's the thing that changes everything. The fundamental reality that explains so much about why we eat what we eat. Energy is lost at every single step. The 10% rule. Imagine you have a grassland bathed in sunlight. The grass, over the course of a growing season, captures some of that solar energy and converts it into plant matter. Let's say, for the sake of simple numbers, that the grass captures 10,000 units of energy. A cow eats that grass, but the cow doesn't get 10,000 units of energy from it. Most of that energy is already gone. The grass used some of it to grow, to maintain its own cells, to reproduce. Some of it was in parts of the plant the cow couldn't digest, like cellulose, which passes right through. Some of it is lost as heat during digestion, during the chemical processes that break down plant matter into nutrients the cow can absorb. By the time all is said and done, the cow gets about 1,000 units of energy from grass that contain 10,000 units. 90% of the energy is lost. Only 10% is passed on. This is called the 10% rule, and it's one of the most important principles in ecology. It's not perfectly precise. The exact percentage varies depending on the specific organisms involved, the type of food, the efficiency of digestion. But as a general principle, it holds remarkably well across ecosystems around the world. About 10% of the energy at one trophic level makes it to the next level. The other 90% is lost. Now let's continue up the chain. A human eats the cow, but the human doesn't get 1,000 units of energy from cow meat that contains 1,000 units. Again, energy is lost. The cow used much of that energy to live, to walk around, to maintain body temperature, to digest food, to do all the things cows do. Some of that energy went into bones and hide and parts of the cow that humans don't typically eat. Some is lost as heat during the cooking process. By the time the human digests the beef, they get about 100 units of energy from meat that came from a cow that ate grass containing 10,000 units of energy. That's a 99% loss. Only 1% of the original plant energy ends up as human energy. Now imagine we go one step further. Imagine we're trying to raise a carnivore, a lion, and we're feeding it that cow. The lion eats the cow meat, and again, the 10% rule applies. The lion gets about 100 units of energy from the cow that got 1,000 units from the grass that had 10,000 units. But then the lion uses most of that energy to live, to move, to hunt, to do lion things. If a human then ate the lion, they would get about 10 units of energy, 10 units, from grass that contained 10,000 units, and 99.9% loss. Do you see the problem? Do you see why carnivore farms don't exist? It's not sustainable. It's not efficient. It's a terrible way to produce food. Every time you add another trophic level, you lose 90% of the energy. Herbivores are already one step removed from plants. Carnivores that eat herbivores are 2 steps removed. Carnivores that eat other carnivores are 3 steps removed. By the time you get to that 3rd step, there's almost no energy left. This is why There are always more plants than herbivores in any ecosystem. It's why there are always more herbivores than carnivores. It's why apex predators are rare. It's why you'll never see a field full of grazing lions the way you see a field full of grazing cattle. The energy isn't there to support it. The implications unfold. Let's make this concrete with a real-world example. Imagine you have an acre of land. You could use that land to grow crops, plants that capture solar energy directly. Let's say you grow corn. That corn captures a certain amount of solar energy over the growing season. You could eat that corn directly. You could get most of the energy the corn captured, minus what you can't digest. Or you could feed that corn to a chicken. The chicken converts 10% of the corn's energy into chicken meat. You eat the chicken. You get 10% of what you would have gotten if you'd eaten the corn directly. Or you could feed that corn to a cow. The cow converts 10% of the corn's energy into beef. You eat the beef. Again, you get 10% of what you would have gotten from the corn. Now, let's imagine you're trying to raise a carnivore. You can't feed it corn. It needs meat. So you have to grow corn to feed to chickens, to feed to your carnivore. The corn captures X amount of energy. The chickens convert 10% of that to chicken meat. The carnivore converts 10% of that to carnivore meat. You've lost 99% of the energy before you even get to the eating part. This is why every agricultural society in human history has based its food production on herbivores or on plants directly. It's why the great civilizations were built on wheat, rice, corn. Why their meat came from cattle, pigs, chickens. Why experiments with raising carnivores for food have always failed. The energy economics don't work. They can't work. Not on a large scale. Not if you're trying to feed a civilization. The mathematics of energy transfer impose hard limits on what's possible. You can't cheat them. You can't find a workaround. They're as fundamental as gravity, and they mean that carnivore meat will always be, inherently, astronomically more expensive to produce than herbivore meat. In terms of the resources required, this doesn't mean humans have never eaten carnivores. Of course we have. When you're hunting in the wild, when you're a prehistoric human and you kill a bear, energy efficiency doesn't matter. The bear is already there. Its energy came from the wild ecosystem, not from your farm. You didn't pay the energy cost of raising it. You just pay the cost of killing it, which is considerable, but that's a different calculation. But when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to farming, when it comes to deliberately raising animals for food, the 10% rule is absolute, and it explains why, when humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture, when they started deliberately managing animal populations for food, they focused on herbivores. Not because carnivores weren't tasty, not because they were scared, not because of culture or religion, but because of energy, because the math demanded it. The trophic pyramid ecologists sometimes draw this as a pyramid. At the bottom, a wide base of primary producers. Above it, a smaller tier of herbivores. Above that, a yet smaller tier of carnivores. Sometimes there's one more tier at the top, the apex predators, the carnivores that eat carnivores. Each tier is smaller than the one below it because each tier has less energy available. The pyramid shape is mandatory. It's a physical law. You can't have more predators than prey in a stable ecosystem. There isn't enough energy to support it. In the ocean, it might be phytoplankton at the bottom. tiny floating plants capturing sunlight. Above them, zooplankton, tiny animals eating the tiny plants. Above them, small fish eating the zooplankton. Above them, larger fish eating the small fish. Above them, seals eating the larger fish. Above them, orcas eating the seals. 6 trophic levels. By the time you get to the orca, the apex predator, 99.999% of the original energy is gone. In a grassland, it might be grass, then grasshoppers, then birds, then hawks. In a forest, plants, then deer, then wolves. The specific species change, but the structure is the same. The energy dynamics are the same. The 10% rule is the same. And humans, clever humans, figured this out, not with equations and textbooks, but through experience. They learned over thousands of years that you can feed many more people on a diet of grains and herbivore meat than on a diet of carnivore meat. They learned that a field of wheat can feed a village. A herd of cattle can supplement that wheat. But a pride of lions, even if you could somehow contain and manage them, would require massive herds of prey animals, which would in turn require vast fields of grass. And at the end of all that, you'd have very little lion meat to show for it. This knowledge didn't need to be explicit. It didn't need to be written down or taught in schools. It was embedded in practice, in the accumulated wisdom of what worked and what didn't. And what worked was eating low on the food chain. What worked was eating plants when possible, herbivores when available, and generally avoiding carnivores unless circumstances left no choice. The 10% rule is invisible, but its effects are everywhere. It shapes the structure of ecosystems. It determines the abundance of species. It constrains the possibilities of agriculture. And it is one of the primary reasons, perhaps the most fundamental reason, why humans don't eat carnivores. Not because we're afraid of them, though we might be. Not because they taste bad, though they might. But because the energy isn't there. The physics won't allow it. And 10,000 years of agricultural practice have proven again and again that fighting physics is a losing battle. Energy and everything this principle, this 10% rule, this flow of energy through trophic levels, it's not just an interesting fact about ecology. It's a lens through which we can understand so much of human history. Why civilizations arose where they did. Why certain animals were domesticated and others weren't. Why some societies thrived and others struggled. Why the agricultural revolution happened the way it did. Because the agricultural revolution wasn't just about learning to plant seeds. It was about learning to manage energy flow. It was about understanding implicitly that capturing solar energy through plants and then converting some of that plant energy into animal protein through herbivores was the most efficient way to feed a growing population. It was about building a food system that worked with the laws of thermodynamics, not against them. And part of that food system, a part so fundamental that it's barely even noticeable, was the decision not to eat carnivores, or rather, not the decision, because it probably didn't feel like a decision. It probably felt like common sense, like obvious practice, like the way things are done. But it was a decision nonetheless, and it was the right one, validated by 10,000 years of agricultural success. This is the foundation. This is the base layer of understanding. Energy efficiency, the 10% rule, the invisible architecture of food chains. Everything else we're going to discuss, bioaccumulation, taste, culture, religion, domestication, all of it rests on this foundation. All of it makes more sense when you understand that carnivores are fundamentally an expensive and inefficient source of food. But energy efficiency isn't the whole story. If it were, we might expect humans to eat carnivores occasionally when they're available in the wild, when we're not paying the energy cost of raising them. And sometimes we do, but not as often as you might expect. Not with the enthusiasm we bring to eating other wild game. There's something else going on. Something about carnivores themselves, about what accumulates in their bodies over a lifetime of eating other animals. Something dangerous, something toxic. There's a river that runs through industrial heartlands. For decades, factories lined its banks, releasing chemicals into the water. Mercury from manufacturing plants, lead from old pipes, cadmium from battery production, PCBs from electrical equipment. These chemicals settled into the sediment, dissolved in the water, became part of the river's ecosystem. At the bottom of this river, tiny algae float, single-celled organisms that capture sunlight and drift with the current. These algae absorb mercury from the water. Not much, just trace amounts. The concentration is low enough that if you tested the water, you might not even worry about it. Parts per billion. Barely detectable. But these algae don't live alone. Tiny zooplankton, microscopic animals, feed on them. Each zooplankton eats hundreds, thousands of algae over its short life. And with each algae it consumes, it takes in that trace amount of mercury. The zooplankton can't break down mercury, can't excrete it effectively. The mercury accumulates in its tissues, in its fatty cells, in its organs. The concentration in the zooplankton is higher than it was in the algae. Not dramatically higher, but measurably so. Small fish eat the zooplankton. A fish doesn't eat just one zooplankton. It eats hundreds, thousands, over weeks and months. With each meal, more mercury enters its body, and like the zooplankton, the fish can't efficiently eliminate it. The mercury stays, accumulates, builds up. The concentration in the fish's tissues is higher than it was in the zooplankton. Larger fish eat the small fish. A pike, a bass, a walleye. These are predators. They eat dozens of smaller fish. Each of those fish is already carrying accumulated mercury from all the zooplankton they ate, from all the algae those zooplankton consumed. The larger fish is now accumulating mercury that has already been concentrated twice. The levels in its body are significantly higher than in the smaller fish, dramatically higher than in the algae. And then, at the top of this food chain, there might be an even larger predator, an osprey perhaps, a bird that catches fish, or a seal in coastal waters, or a human standing on the shore with a fishing rod. This top predator is accumulating mercury that has been concentrated 4 times. The levels in its body, in its organs, in the fatty tissues where mercury likes to settle, are thousands of times higher than they were in the original water. This is bioaccumulation. This is biomagnification. And this is why eating carnivores is dangerous. The chemistry of concentration. Let's understand exactly what's happening here, because the process is both elegant and terrifying in its efficiency. Certain chemicals, certain toxins, have a few key properties that make them extraordinarily dangerous in food chains. First, they're persistent. They don't break down easily. Where something like sugar or protein can be metabolized, converted into energy or building blocks, these toxins remain intact. Mercury stays mercury. PCBs stay PCBs. They might change form slightly, but they don't disappear. Second, they're lipophilic, which means fat-loving. They dissolve in fat, they're stored in fatty tissues, and they stay there. Animals have a hard time excreting them. They can eliminate some slowly over time, but the process is so slow that accumulation outpaces elimination. An animal that takes in 1 unit of mercury per week, but can only eliminate 0.05 units per week, will steadily accumulate mercury throughout its life. Third, they're often relatively harmless at very low concentrations. The algae doesn't die from the trace mercury in the water. The zooplankton functions fine with slightly higher levels. The small fish seems healthy despite having mercury in its tissues. But there's a threshold, a tipping point, where the concentration becomes toxic, and that threshold is often reached in top predators. This combination of persistence, fat solubility, and slow elimination creates a mathematical inevitability. Energy decreases as you go up the food chain, but toxins increase. It's an inverse pyramid. Less and less energy, more and more poison. Mercury. A case study. Let's focus on mercury for a moment because it's one of the best studied examples and one of the most insidious. Mercury is released into the environment through industrial processes, coal burning, mining, manufacturing. It enters waterways as inorganic mercury, which is relatively less toxic. But bacteria in the water convert it into methylmercury, an organic form that is highly toxic and easily absorbed by living organisms. Methylmercury binds to proteins in muscle tissue. This means it gets incorporated into the very flesh of the animal. You can't cook it out. You can't wash it off. It's part of the tissue itself. When one animal eats another, it's eating that methylmercury along with the protein. In humans, methylmercury is a neurotoxin. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It interferes with the development of the nervous system. In fetuses and young children, it can cause severe developmental problems, affecting cognition, motor skills, sensory function. In adults, high levels can cause tremors, vision problems, cognitive impairment, even death in extreme cases. The famous case of Minamata disease in Japan provides a stark illustration. A chemical company released methylmercury into the bay. The local fish accumulated it. People in the fishing community ate those fish regularly, sometimes daily. Over time, hundreds of people developed neurological symptoms. Some died. Many suffered permanent damage. Children born to mothers who had consumed contaminated fish showed severe birth defects. The tragedy of Minamata revealed just how efficiently methylmercury biomagnifies. The concentration in the most contaminated fish reached levels thousands of times higher than in the water. People who ate those fish regularly were consuming concentrated toxin with every meal. Now, here's the crucial point for our question about carnivores. Predatory fish had the highest levels. Fish that ate other fish. Tuna, swordfish, shark. These large predators at the top of the ocean's food chains can have mercury concentrations that exceed safe levels for human consumption. Regulatory agencies around the world advise pregnant women and young children to avoid these fish entirely and recommend that everyone limit their intake. But notice something. We still eat tuna. We still eat swordfish. Despite the mercury risk, we manage it with advisories and consumption limits, but we don't avoid these carnivorous fish entirely. Why? We'll come back to that question, because the answer is interesting and involves some subtle distinctions. But For now, keep it in mind as an exception, or perhaps a modification, to the rule about avoiding carnivores, PCBs and other persistent pollutants. Mercury isn't alone. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, are another class of persistent organic pollutants that biomagnify through food chains. These were widely used in electrical equipment, transformers, capacitors, because they were excellent insulators and very stable. That stability, wonderful for electrical applications, became a nightmare when they entered ecosystems. PCBs were banned in many countries in the late 1970s after scientists discovered they were toxic, potentially carcinogenic, and accumulating in wildlife and humans. But ban came too late to prevent massive environmental contamination. PCBs are so stable that they persist in sediments, soils, and water decades after their use ended. They continue to enter food chains and biomagnify, even now, 50 years after production stopped. Studies of killer whales in the Pacific Northwest found some of the highest PCB concentrations ever recorded in any wild animal. These apex predators, eating seals and fish who themselves ate smaller fish, had accumulated PCBs at levels that likely affect their immune systems, reproductive success, and overall health. The most contaminated individuals had concentrations so high that their bodies would technically qualify as hazardous waste. DDT, the pesticide that nearly drove bald eagles and peregrine falcons to extinction, is another example. DDT was sprayed on crops to kill insects. It washed into waterways. It was absorbed by aquatic plants and plankton. Fish ate the plankton. Birds ate the fish. The DDT concentrated at each step. By the time it reached the birds of prey at the top of the food chain, the concentrations were high enough to interfere with calcium metabolism, causing them to produce eggs with shells so thin they broke under the weight of the incubating parent. The recovery of these bird populations after DDT was banned is a testament to the importance of understanding biomagnification. Once the source of contamination was removed, once bioaccumulation stopped adding to the burden in the environment, populations could begin to recover. But it took decades, and it only worked because we stopped adding more DDT to the system. Bioaccumulation in terrestrial predators. We've been focusing on aquatic examples, but bioaccumulation affects terrestrial carnivores too. Heavy metals, pesticides, industrial chemicals, they all enter land-based food chains as well. They accumulate in predators just as they do in fish. Studies of wolves have found elevated levels of various contaminants. Polar bears, eating seals that eat fish that eat plankton, accumulate mercury and PCBs at alarming levels. Some populations of polar bears have contamination levels that may affect their health and reproduction. Bears that feed heavily on fish, like grizzly bears during salmon runs, can accumulate more toxins than bears that eat primarily plants and small mammals. The difference isn't trivial. The fish-eating bears are taking on the accumulated burden of everything those salmon ate during their years in the ocean. Birds of prey, eagles, hawks, owls, they're all subject to bioaccumulation. Any carnivore that feeds primarily on other animals is at risk, and the higher up the food chain they are, the more carnivorous their diet, the greater the concentration of pollutants in their tissues. This creates a perverse situation where the animals we might admire most, the apex predators, the icons of wildness and power, are often the most contaminated. Their position at the top of the food chain, their success as predators, becomes a liability when toxins enter the ecosystem. The human health connection. So what does this mean for humans who might eat these animals? It means risk. Direct, measurable, potentially severe health risk. When you eat a carnivore, you're eating everything it accumulated over its lifetime. If it was a long-lived predator, if it fed on contaminated prey, if it lived in an environment with industrial pollution, you're taking on that burden. The health effects depend on the specific contaminants and the dose. Mercury, as we discussed, affects the nervous system. PCBs are linked to cancer, immune suppression, endocrine disruption. Lead affects cognitive function, particularly in children. Cadmium damages kidneys. The list goes on. Some of these effects are acute, immediate. Eat enough contaminated meat at once and you'll get sick. But most bioaccumulation-related health problems are chronic. They develop over time, with repeated exposure. They might not be obviously linked to diet, especially if decades pass between exposure and effect. This makes bioaccumulation particularly insidious. The algae in the river doesn't look dangerous. The water doesn't look toxic. The fish seems healthy when caught. Even the person eating the fish might not notice any immediate effects, but year after year, meal after meal, the burden grows. The mercury in the body increases, and eventually, symptoms emerge. Now, did our ancestors understand this? Did people 10,000 years ago know about methylmercury and PCBs and biomagnification? Of course not. The science of toxicology didn't exist. The industrial pollutants we worry about today didn't exist, but they may have noticed patterns. They may have noticed that people who ate a lot of predator meat seemed to get sick more often, or that certain animals, when eaten, seem to cause problems, or that consuming the liver of a bear, where toxins concentrate, led to illness. These observations, passed down as warnings, as traditions, as taboos, may have encoded practical wisdom about bioaccumulation long before anyone understood the chemistry. The vitamin A story. Here's a fascinating historical case that might illustrate this point. Polar bears have extraordinarily high levels of vitamin A in their livers. Vitamin A is essential, but in very high doses, it's toxic. Arctic explorers, desperate and starving, sometimes ate polar bear liver. Those who did often became violently ill. Symptoms included severe headaches, vomiting, peeling skin, even death. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic knew this. They avoided polar bear liver, or if they did eat it, they were extremely careful about portions and preparation. They had learned through experience that this particular food was dangerous. Now, vitamin A hypervitaminosis isn't bioaccumulation in the same sense as mercury or PCBs, but it illustrates how carnivores can accumulate substances in dangerous concentrations. And it shows that traditional knowledge, empirical observation over generations, could identify these dangers long before science explained them. The subtlety of modern contamination. In the modern world, bioaccumulation is more complex and widespread than ever before. We've released tens of thousands of synthetic chemicals into the environment. Many are persistent, many are toxic, many biomagnify. We don't always know which ones or at what concentrations they become dangerous until we start seeing effects in wildlife or humans. PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, are a recent example. Used in non-stick coatings, firefighting foam, water-resistant fabrics, these compounds are incredibly persistent. They're showing up in drinking water, in wildlife, in human blood, and they're starting to accumulate in food chains. The long-term health effects are still being studied, but early evidence suggests they may affect the immune system, hormone function, and more. This is the world we live in now. Every ecosystem on Earth has some level of contamination. Even remote locations far from any industry have detectable levels of persistent pollutants carried there by air and water currents. And that means every animal in every food chain is potentially accumulating toxins. Herbivores still accumulate less than carnivores on average. The 10% rule applies to energy, but toxins biomagnify. Every step up the food chain concentrates them further. This makes carnivores, particularly long-lived ones, particularly ones high on the food chain, risky to eat. The fish exception. Explained earlier, I mentioned that we still eat carnivorous fish despite bioaccumulation concerns. Why? What makes fish different? Part of the answer is cultural and historical. Humans have been eating fish for tens of thousands of years, long before industrial contamination became an issue. Fish are deeply embedded in human cuisines around the world. The taste is valued. The nutritional benefits, particularly the omega-3 fatty acids in fish like salmon and tuna, are significant, so there's strong cultural and nutritional incentive to keep eating fish. But there's also a practical calculation. The health benefits of fish consumption, for most people, outweigh the risks from contamination. This is especially true for smaller, shorter-lived fish that haven't had as much time to accumulate toxins. Sardines, anchovies, herring. These small fish are lower on the food chain and generally safer. The regulatory response has been to advise moderation and selectivity. Eat fish, yes, but maybe not tuna steaks every day. Avoid the biggest, oldest predators. Pregnant women should be especially careful. The goal is to get the benefits while minimizing the risks. Contrast this with land-based carnivores. There's no nutritional necessity to eat wolf meat or tiger flesh. There's no long cultural tradition of farming lions. The incentive to accept the bioaccumulation risk simply isn't there. And so the default, the path of least resistance, is to avoid them. Bioaccumulation and the agricultural revolution. Now let's connect this back to our broader story. When humans started farming, when they began deliberately raising animals for food, they were making choices, not always conscious, not always explicit, but choices nonetheless. Which animals to domesticate, which to pursue, which to avoid. Bioaccumulation, though not understood in modern scientific terms, would have been encountered as a practical problem. If you tried to farm carnivores, if you raise predators for food, your livestock would be eating contaminated prey. They would accumulate whatever those prey animals carried, and you, eating the carnivore meat, would be at the top of that food chain, receiving the most concentrated dose. In a world without industrial pollution, this might not have been as serious. But even then, natural toxins exist. Heavy metals occur naturally in some environments. Certain plants produce compounds that accumulate in herbivores and then in the predators that eat them. The risk was always there, just at lower levels than today. The energy inefficiency argument we discussed earlier was probably more immediately obvious. You can see that it takes more food to raise a carnivore. You can count the animals you need to feed to your predators. But bioaccumulation is invisible. The mercury in the fish doesn't announce itself. The PCBs in the seal don't glow. Yet the effects, over time, might have been noticeable. Communities that ate more carnivore meat might have had worse health outcomes, more mysterious illnesses, more problems with pregnancy and infant health. These patterns, observed over generations, could have led to the conclusion that eating carnivores was somehow unwise, even without understanding the mechanism, the precautionary principle. This brings us to an interesting concept, the precautionary principle. When you don't fully understand the risks, when the science isn't complete, but there's evidence of potential harm, what do? Traditional societies often encoded precaution in their food practices. Certain animals were avoided, not because anyone could explain biochemically why they were dangerous, but because experience suggested they were. This is wisdom. This is applied learning, and it saved lives. Modern science has the luxury of explaining these dangers in molecular detail. We can measure mercury in parts per billion. We can trace the pathway of PCBs through food chains. We can quantify risk with statistical models. But the conclusion is the same as the one traditional societies reached through observation. Eating high on the food chain is risky. Carnivores, by definition, eat high on the food chain, and so eating carnivores puts you at the very top, receiving the most concentrated dose of whatever toxins are present in that ecosystem. In pristine environments, that might be acceptable. In contaminated ones, it's dangerous. And since most environments now have some level of contamination, the general principle holds: avoid carnivores. The modern regulatory response today: regulatory agencies around the world monitor contaminant levels in food. They set limits. They issue advisories. For fish, this has resulted in detailed guidance about which species to eat and how often. For land-based carnivores, the guidance is simpler: don't. Not because land carnivores are more contaminated than marine ones necessarily, but because there's no compelling reason to eat them. The risk-benefit calculation doesn't favor it, and so the regulations, the advisories, the public health guidance all point in the same direction. Stick to herbivores and omnivores, or if you eat carnivores, stick to fish and be selective. This isn't new wisdom. It's ancient wisdom, validated and explained by modern science. Our ancestors didn't need to understand biomagnification to know that certain animals were better avoided. They learned through experience. They passed down that knowledge. And we, with our microscopes and mass spectrometers, have confirmed that they were right. The weight of invisible burden. There's something haunting about bioaccumulation. It's invisible warfare. The toxins are silent. They don't announce their presence. The contaminated animal looks healthy, acts healthy, might even be healthy in most respects. But inside, in the tissues, in the cells, the burden is there. A polar bear hunting seals on Arctic ice appears magnificent, powerful, a perfect predator. But tests of its tissues reveal a body full of PCBs and mercury, contamination that traveled thousands of miles from factories the bear has never seen, accumulated through a food chain the bear doesn't understand, concentrating in flesh that might, in other circumstances, be food. This is the modern world. This is what we've done. We've contaminated the food chain so thoroughly that even the most remote predators carry our industrial legacy in their bodies. And this contamination is yet another reason, added to all the others, why eating carnivores is inadvisable. It's not the only reason. It's not even necessarily the primary reason, historically, but it's a real reason, a growing reason, a reason that will only become more important as contamination continues to spread and persist. So we add bioaccumulation to our list. Energy inefficiency makes carnivores expensive to raise. Bioaccumulation makes them dangerous to eat. Two strong reasons, rooted in fundamental properties of ecology and chemistry. But we're not done. There's still the question of taste, of flavor, of why carnivore meat, even when available and safe, often doesn't appeal to human palates. And that's where we turn next, to the biology of muscle, the chemistry of flavor, and the texture of meat. Close your eyes and imagine biting into a perfectly cooked steak. Not just any steak, but one that's been aged properly, seasoned well, cooked to your preferred doneness. As your teeth sink into the meat, as you begin to chew, your mouth floods with flavor. There's the richness of fat, the savory umami of protein, the slight metallic tang of myoglobin, the complex aroma compounds released by cooking. It's delicious. Your brain lights up with pleasure. This is good food. Now imagine biting into a piece of lion meat. You probably can't, because you've never tried it. Neither have I. Neither have most people. But those who have, those intrepid souls who've eaten predator meat in survival situations or out of curiosity, often report something different. The meat is lean, tough. The flavor is described as strong, gamey, sometimes unpleasant. It's meat, yes. Protein, yes. But it doesn't trigger the same pleasure response. It doesn't taste good in the way that beef or pork or chicken tastes good. Why? What's different about carnivore meat? What is it about the muscle tissue of predators that makes it less appealing to human taste buds? The answer lies in muscle biology, in the chemistry of flavor compounds, in the evolutionary adaptations that make a lion good at hunting and, coincidentally, less good at being food. The architecture of muscle meat is muscle. When you eat a steak, you're eating the tissue that allowed a cow to walk, to chew, to move. Muscle tissue is remarkably complex, a feat of biological engineering. It's composed of fibers, long cells packed with proteins that can contract and relax, generating force. These fibers are bundled together, surrounded by connective tissue, threaded through with blood vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients. But not all muscle is the same. There are different types of muscle fibers optimized for different tasks. Some are built for endurance, for sustained activity, for the long haul. Others are built for power, for quick bursts of strength. The composition of an animal's muscles, the ratio of different fiber types, depends on what that animal does, how it lives, what evolutionary pressures shaped it. Herbivores, for the most part, don't need explosive power. A cow doesn't sprint. It walks, grazes, occasionally trots. Its muscles are optimized for steady, low-intensity activity. This means they're composed primarily of slow-twitch muscle fibers. These fibers use aerobic metabolism, burning oxygen and fat to generate energy slowly and sustainably. They're rich in myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen, giving them a red color. They're marbled with fat, which provides fuel for the slow burn of aerobic metabolism. Carnivores, by contrast, need power. A lion lying in wait for a gazelle doesn't need endurance. It needs explosive acceleration. It needs to sprint, chase, tackle, kill. Its muscles are optimized for anaerobic power, for the kind of activity that can only be sustained for seconds or minutes before exhaustion sets in. This means they have more fast-twitch muscle fibers. These fibers use anaerobic metabolism, burning glucose without oxygen, generating force quickly but unsustainably, They're leaner, with less intramuscular fat. They're designed for short, intense efforts. This fundamental difference in muscle composition translates directly into meat quality. Slow twitch fibers, rich in myoglobin and intramuscular fat, produce tender, flavorful meat. Fast twitch fibers, lean and built for power, produce tough, less flavorful meat. Myoglobin and the taste of iron. Let's talk about myoglobin in more detail, because it's central to meat flavor. Myoglobin is a protein, similar to hemoglobin in blood, but found in muscle tissue. Its job is to store oxygen, making it available to muscle cells for aerobic metabolism. The more a muscle is used aerobically, the more oxygen it needs, the more myoglobin it typically contains. The more myoglobin, the redder the meat. This is why chicken breast, which comes from muscles that aren't used much in a bird that rarely flies, is white meat. Those chest muscles in a chicken have little myoglobin, but chicken legs and thighs, from muscles used constantly for walking, are dark meat, rich in myoglobin. In cows, which are always standing and walking, most muscles have significant myoglobin content. Beef is red meat. The muscles that work hardest, like those in the legs and shoulders, are the darkest. Myoglobin contributes to flavor. When meat is cooked, myoglobin undergoes chemical changes that create the characteristic taste of cooked meat. That slightly metallic, savory flavor we associate with beef. It's part of what makes meat taste like meat. But here's the thing. Carnivores, with their fast-twitch muscle fibers optimized for short bursts, tend to have different myoglobin distributions than herbivores with endurance-based muscles. Predators don't always need to sustain activity for hours. Many need explosive speed for minutes. Their muscles can reflect this. The relationship between muscle type and myoglobin is complex, varying by species and lifestyle. There are exceptions. Some carnivores do have muscles rich in myoglobin, particularly if they engage in sustained activity. Wolves, who chase prey over long distances, may have redder muscle than a cat who pounces from ambush. The picture is more nuanced than a simple carnivore versus herbivore divide, but general patterns do emerge. Fat and flavor. Fat is flavor. This is a truth every chef knows. Fat carries aromatic compounds. It melts in the mouth, creating a pleasant sensation. It conducts heat differently than muscle during cooking, creating textural contrast. When you eat marbled beef, you're enjoying the interplay of lean muscle and ribbons of fat, each contributing to the overall experience. Herbivores. Eating plant-based diets rich in carbohydrates store fat effectively. Cows get fat. Pigs get fat. This fat is deposited within muscles, creating marbling, and in layers under the skin and around organs. This fat is relatively bland in flavor, taking on the characteristics of the animal's diet. Grass-fed beef tastes different from grain-fed beef, partly because of differences in the fatty acid composition of the fat, influenced by what the animal ate. Carnivores, eating high-protein diets, tend to stay lean. Their bodies are optimized for hunting, for movement, for power-to-weight ratios that allow them to catch prey. Excess fat is a liability, slowing them down. So predators, especially those that hunt actively, maintain low body fat. The meat is lean, with little intramuscular fat. Lean meat can be tough. Fat lubricates the muscle fibers, making them easier to chew, more pleasant to eat. Fat also insulates the muscle during cooking, helping it stay moist. Lean meat dries out more easily, becomes stringy, requires careful cooking to remain palatable. anyone who's cooked venison knows this. Deer are lean animals, constantly moving, burning calories. Venison is notoriously prone to drying out if overcooked. It lacks the forgiving fat content of beef. And deer are herbivores. Carnivores are even leaner. The diet effect, what an animal eats, affects the flavor of its meat. This is well established. Grass-fed beef tastes different from grain-fed. Pork from pigs raised on acorns has a distinct flavor. Wild boar tastes different from farmed pork, partly because of diet differences. Herbivores eat plants. Those plants contain various compounds, some of which end up in the animal's fat and muscle. These compounds contribute to flavor, but generally in subtle ways that humans have evolved to find pleasant or at least neutral. The flavors we associate with good meat, beefy, porcine, lamb-like, they come partly from the diet of these animals, filtered through their digestive systems and metabolism. Carnivores eat meat. They eat the flesh of other animals with all its proteins, fats, and residual compounds. This creates a different flavor profile. There's a reason wild predators often have meat described as gamey or strong. That strong flavor comes from their diet, from a lifetime of eating other animals. There's also the issue of urea and other waste products. Animals that eat high-protein diets produce more nitrogenous waste. Some of this can end up in muscle tissue, particularly if the animal is stressed or not properly handled after death. These compounds may contribute to off flavors, to the strong taste that many people find unpleasant in predator meat. Historically, hunters have known this. The protocol for processing game animals, herbivores or carnivores, involves careful and quick bleeding to remove as much blood as possible. But even with perfect technique, carnivore meat often retains flavors that make it less desirable. Texture, the mechanical properties. Tenderness is a major component of meat quality. Humans prefer tender meat. We like it to yield easily to chewing, to not require extensive jaw work. Tough meat is harder to digest, less pleasant to eat, and culturally associated with lower quality. Tenderness depends on several factors: the type of muscle fibers, the amount of connective tissue, the animal's age, how the meat is prepared and cooked. But in general, muscles that are used intensely, that are constantly worked, tend to be tougher. The connective tissue that holds muscle fibers together becomes stronger, more cross-linked. The fibers themselves become denser. Predators have muscles built for power. These muscles work hard during hunts, even if those hunts are brief. The legs of a cheetah, the jaw muscles of a crocodile. These are powerful, dense, tough. When converted to meat, they don't offer the tenderness of a cow's muscle, which is built for low-intensity grazing. There are ways to tenderize tough meat. Long, slow cooking can break down connective tissue. Marinades with acidic or enzymatic compounds can tenderize. Mechanical tenderizing, pounding, or scoring the meat can help. But these are workarounds, solutions to a problem. The problem is that the meat is fundamentally tougher to begin with. With herbivores, especially young, well-fed ones, tenderness comes naturally. You don't need elaborate preparation. A properly cooked steak from a well-marbled cow is tender without intervention. This ease of preparation, this natural palatability, is part of why these animals became food staples. The umami dimension. Umami is the fifth taste, the savory flavor that makes meat, mushrooms, aged cheese, and fermented food so satisfying. It's mediated by glutamate and other amino acids that signal protein richness to our taste receptors. meat is a prime source of umami and part of why we crave it. Interestingly, the umami content of meat can vary based on the animal's muscle composition. Research has shown that certain types of muscle fibers, particularly slow-twitch fibers, tend to have higher levels of free amino acids that contribute to umami taste. This means that meat from endurance-adapted muscles might taste richer, more satisfying, than meat from power-adapted muscles. This isn't a hard and fast rule, and the research is still developing, but it suggests another reason why herbivore meat might be preferred. Their muscles, optimized for sustained grazing and walking, might simply taste more umami-rich, more satisfying at a fundamental level. The age factor. Young animals tend to have more tender meat than old ones. This is why veal, lamb, and suckling pig are delicacies. The muscles haven't had as much time to develop tough connective tissue. The meat is more tender, often milder in flavor. But with carnivores, even young animals can have tough meat because their muscles are built differently from the start. A young lion still has muscles adapted for power, even if it hasn't fully grown into its strength yet. The fundamental architecture of predator muscle is different from prey muscle. Moreover, carnivores in the wild tend to live longer before being eaten, if they're eaten at all. A cow might be slaughtered at 2 or 3 years old, still young, meat at its peak. A wild lion that's hunted is likely to be older, its meat tougher, its flavor stronger. The cooking challenge. Different meats require different cooking approaches. Beef can be cooked rare, medium, well done. Pork, historically cooked thoroughly to avoid parasites, is now sometimes served medium because modern farming has reduced parasite risks. Chicken must be fully cooked for safety. Each type of meat has an optimal preparation method that maximizes flavor and texture. Carnivore meat, when it has been prepared, often requires careful cooking to be palatable. It can't typically be served rare, both for safety reasons and because the flavor is too strong. But cooking it thoroughly makes it even tougher. It's a difficult balance, requiring skill and experience. For most people, throughout history, this challenge wasn't worth the effort. When you have access to beef, pork, or chicken, meat that's easier to cook and more consistently delicious, why bother with difficult, tough, strong-flavored carnivore meat? The exceptional fish. Once again, we come to the exception: carnivorous fish. Tuna, salmon, swordfish, these are predators. They eat other fish. Yet, they're prized for their flavor, considered delicacies, sold at premium prices. What makes them different? The answer lies partly in their physiology. Fish, particularly large oceanic fish, have a different muscle structure than terrestrial animals. They swim constantly using aerobic metabolism, and their muscles are rich in myoglobin and fat, particularly omega-3 fatty acids. These omega-3 fats are liquid at low temperatures, remaining soft and almost oily even when cold. This gives fish flesh a unique texture, a richness that's different from terrestrial meat. Moreover, fish fat tastes different than terrestrial animal fat. It has a distinct flavor profile, often described as clean or fresh, when the fish is high quality. The omega-3 fatty acids that concentrate in carnivorous fish are actually beneficial to human health, conferring cardiovascular benefits. So there's a strong nutritional incentive to eat these fish, despite their position on the food chain. The muscle structure of fish is also fundamentally different. Fish muscle is organized in sheets called myotomes. separated by thin layers of connective tissue. When cooked, these layers separate easily, giving fish its characteristic flaky texture. This structure is different from the long muscle fibers of mammals, and it creates different textural properties. Finally, fish don't have the same strong, gamey flavors often associated with terrestrial carnivores. This might be due to their diet, to differences in how they process waste, or to simple differences in meat chemistry. Whatever the reason, carnivorous fish taste good in a way that terrestrial carnivores often don't. So fish get a pass. They're carnivores, but delicious ones. The exception that proves the rule, or perhaps the exception that complicates it, showing that the relationship between diet and palatability isn't absolute. Evolutionary taste. Preferences. Humans have evolved taste preferences that guide us towards safe, nutritious foods and away from dangerous ones. Sweet tastes signal carbohydrates, energy. Salty tastes signal necessary minerals. Umami signals protein. Bitter tastes warn of potential toxins. Many plant poisons are bitter. It's possible that our preference for tender, fatty, mildly flavored meat is itself an evolutionary adaptation. The characteristics of good herbivore meat, tender, marbled, rich in myoglobin, tend to be associated with high nutritional value and potentially lower risk. The characteristics often found in carnivore meat, tough, lean, strong flavored, might have signaled higher risk in our evolutionary past, whether from parasites, toxins, or simply difficulty in digestion. This isn't to say carnivore meat is always unpalatable, or that no human has ever enjoyed it. Taste is partly learned, partly cultural. People can acquire taste for strong flavors, for challenging foods, but the default preference, the instinctive reaction, seems to favor the meat of herbivores. The cultural amplification. Once a preference is established, culture amplifies it. Humans are social learners. We eat what our parents ate, what our community eats. Culinary traditions develop around available foods, and those traditions reinforce the preference. In societies where cattle, pigs, and chickens were farmed, an entire cuisine developed around those meats. Recipes were refined over generations. Cooking techniques were perfected. Cultural knowledge accumulated about how to raise, slaughter, process, and prepare these animals to produce the best meat. No such culinary tradition developed around carnivores because they weren't farmed. There are no 1,000-year-old recipes for lion stew, no traditional techniques for aging wolf meat, no cultural knowledge about the best way to cook bear steaks. The absence of culinary tradition makes carnivore meat even less appealing. Even if you could get it, you wouldn't know what to do with it. The feedback loop. So we have a feedback loop. Carnivores are hard to farm because of energy inefficiency. They're risky to eat because of bioaccumulation. And on top of all that, they don't even taste particularly good. These factors reinforce each other. Because they don't taste good, there's no strong incentive to overcome the farming difficulties. Because they're hard to farm, there's no cultural development of cooking techniques that might improve the flavor. Because they're risky due to bioaccumulation, even when available, they're avoided. And because they're avoided, there's no familiarity that might lead to acquired taste. The result is a powerful, multifaceted aversion. Not absolute, there are always exceptions, but strong enough, consistent enough, that across cultures and across time, humans have generally looked at carnivores and thought, not food. the taste factor alone might not be enough to explain the pattern. Humans eat all sorts of things that aren't immediately delicious. We eat bitter, vegetables, fermented foods with challenging flavors, insects with strange textures. We're adaptable, but taste combined with energy inefficiency, combined with bioaccumulation risk, combined with farming impracticality, combined with cultural tradition, it all adds up. It creates a barrier so high that only rarely, in extreme circumstances, do humans cross it. And so carnivore meat remains exotic, unusual, something encountered in survival stories or in the diets of a few specialized cultures, not in the everyday meals of most of humanity. We've covered 3 major reasons now: energy efficiency, bioaccumulation, and taste. Each is powerful on its own. Together, they're nearly insurmountable. But we're not done. There's history to explore, deep history. The archaeological record of what our ancestors ate and didn't eat. There are religious traditions to examine, the coded wisdom of dietary laws. There's the story of domestication, of which animals humans successfully tamed, and why. And there are the exceptions, the edge cases that test our understanding. All of this awaits. But for now, understand this. When you sit down to a meal, when you order a burger or a chicken sandwich, when you choose beef over anything carnivorous, you're not just making a random choice. You're participating in a pattern millions of years in the making, a pattern shaped by ecology, chemistry, biology, and culture. You're eating as humans have always eaten, guided by invisible forces you might never have consciously considered. And that's not just interesting, that's profound, because it shows that even our most basic choices, what we eat, are embedded in deep structures of reality, in the laws of thermodynamics, in the chemistry of contamination, in the biology of flavor. We're not separate from nature. We're part of it, shaped by it, constrained by it. Even when we sit in climate-controlled restaurants, reading menus, written in languages that didn't exist when our species first appeared. The absence of carnivores from our plates is nature speaking through culture, science encoded in tradition, reality asserting itself in the form of what tastes good and what doesn't, what works and what fails, what nourishes and what poisons. And now that you understand this, you can't unsee it. Every time you order food, you'll be aware at some level of the invisible reasons behind your choices, the trophic levels, the bioaccumulation gradients, the muscle fiber compositions, all of it working together to guide you, as it guided your ancestors, toward the foods that work, the meals that sustain, the meats that civilization was built upon. So as we move forward, as we explore the history, the religion, the domestication story, keep all of this in mind. The foundation is laid, the science is clear. Now we'll see how it played out in human history, how it was encoded in culture, how it shaped the trajectory of our species. Because carnivores aren't just absent from our plates. They're absent from our farms, our markets, our cookbooks, our traditions. And understanding why, understanding the full picture, is to understand something fundamental about what it means to be human, to eat, to choose, to survive in a world governed by laws we're only beginning to fully comprehend. 10,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, something extraordinary happened. Humans, who had been hunters and gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, began to settle down. They built permanent structures, they planted seeds deliberately, and crucially, they began to keep animals. not just hunt them, keep them, manage them, breed them, control their movement, their diet, their reproduction. This was the agricultural revolution, and it changed everything about human society. But here's what's fascinating. The animals that humans chose to domesticate, the species that became the foundation of agricultural civilization, were almost exclusively herbivores and omnivores. Sheep were among the first, domesticated around 11,000 years ago in the mountains of Southeast Asia and the Fertile Crescent. Then goats, probably around the same time. Shortly after came pigs, omnivores who could eat just about anything but thrived on plant-based diets. And cattle, those massive, placid descendants of the aurochs, domesticated around 10,000 years ago. These four animals, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, became the backbone of agricultural animal husbandry across the Old World. They spread with human migrations. They were adapted to local conditions. Breeds were developed for specific climates, specific purposes. But the fundamental choice had been made. These were the animals humans would raise for food. Later came chickens, domesticated from jungle fowl in Southeast Asia around 4,000 years ago. Horses, tamed on the steppes of Central Asia around 5,000 years ago, though initially kept for meat and milk before their potential as transportation was fully realized. Ducks, geese, turkeys in different parts of the world, llamas and alpacas in South America, water buffalo in Asia. Every single one of these animals shared something in common. They ate plants, or at least could thrive on plant-based diets. Not one of them was a strict carnivore. This wasn't an accident. This was necessity. This was the 10% rule in action, playing out over millennia of trial and error and observation. The criteria for domestication. What makes an animal domesticable? Scientists have studied this question extensively, and several criteria emerge. The animal must breed in captivity. It must tolerate crowding and human proximity. It must have a social structure that allows humans to take the dominant role. It must grow relatively quickly. It must have a diet that humans can reasonably provide at scale. That last criterion is the killer for carnivores. How do you feed a barn full of lions? You need to feed their meat, lots of it. That meat has to come from somewhere. If you're raising prey animals specifically to feed your carnivores, you've just added an entire extra step to your food production system. You're now raising animals to raise animals, and the energy loss at each step makes the entire enterprise nonsensical. Even if you could somehow make it work logistically, even if you had vast herds of prey animals specifically for feeding your carnivore stock, the math doesn't pan out. Remember, only about 10% of the energy in prey makes it into predator flesh. That means for every 100 pounds of prey animal you feed to your carnivores, you get about 10 pounds of carnivore meat. It's wildly inefficient compared to just eating the prey animal directly. Now, you might think, but what if you fed the carnivores on waste, on scraps, on parts of prey animals that humans don't eat? This is actually how dogs were probably first domesticated. They were scavengers hanging around human settlements, eating refuse. Over time, this commensal relationship deepened until dogs became fully domesticated. But dogs are omnivores, not strict carnivores. They can survive on a varied diet. They're not like cats, who require meat to survive. And even cats, though domesticated, were never really raised as livestock. They were kept to control rodents, not to be eaten. Their domestication followed a different pathway entirely. A true carnivore, a lion or a wolf or a bear, can't thrive on scraps and waste. They need substantial amounts of meat, and providing that at scale for a population large enough to constitute livestock is simply impractical. The behavioral problem. There's another issue beyond just food: temperament. The animals that were successfully domesticated had certain behavioral traits that made them amenable to living in close proximity with humans and with each other. Sheep and goats are herd animals. They have a social structure where following a leader is natural. Humans could slot themselves into that role. Cattle are similar. Pigs, though more solitary in the wild, are adaptable and relatively docile when raised from birth by humans. Chickens have a flock mentality that works in farming contexts. Carnivores, especially large ones, are different. Many are solitary or live in small, exclusive groups. They're territorial, they're aggressive, they're equipped with weapons, teeth and claws, designed to kill. Even if you could provide the food, managing a population of predators would be dangerous in ways that managing cattle simply isn't. Yes, some carnivores have been tamed. Cheetahs were used for hunting in ancient civilizations. Foxes have been experimentally domesticated in modern times. But taming and domestication are different things. Taming is getting one individual to tolerate human presence. Domestication is a multi-generational process that results in genetic and behavioral changes that make the entire species more amenable to human management. And even when carnivores can be tamed, the question remains, why bother? What's the payoff? With horses, it's transportation and labor. With dogs, it's companionship and assistance in hunting and herding. But with large carnivores raised for meat, there's no payoff that justifies the effort and risk. The meat would be expensive to produce, dangerous to obtain, and as we've discussed, not particularly palatable anyway. The path not taken. It's worth imagining what would have happened if someone, somewhere, had tried to domesticate carnivores for food. Let's say a group of ancient farmers decided to try raising wolves alongside their sheep. First problem: what do you feed the wolves? If you feed them your sheep, you're reducing your food supply, not increasing it. If you hunt wild game to feed your wolves, you're essentially working as a hunter to support farming wolves, which defeats the purpose of agriculture. Second problem: containment. Wolves are intelligent, strong, and capable of escaping most enclosures that ancient humans could construct. They're also dangerous. A wolf that escapes isn't just a lost asset, it's a threat to people and to other livestock. Third problem: breeding. Wolves have complex social structures and mating behaviors. Managing their reproduction would be challenging. And even if you succeeded, even if you got multiple generations of captive wolves, you'd still be feeding them at enormous cost for relatively little return. The experiment would fail. The farmers would give up. They'd go back to raising sheep, which are docile, eat grass, and produce wool, milk, and meat without trying to eat you. This thought experiment probably played out in reality, in various forms, in various places. Some ambitious person tried to keep predators, realized it didn't work, and went back to what did work. Over time, the knowledge spread. Farm herbivores, not carnivores. Not because of some moral decision, but because of simple practical reality. Religious codification. As human societies developed, as agriculture became established, religious and cultural traditions began to codify the practices that worked. And one thing that appears across multiple religious traditions is restrictions on eating carnivores. In Jewish dietary law, kashrut, there are specific rules about which animals can be eaten. Mammals must have split hooves and chew cud. This immediately excludes carnivores, which have paws, not hooves. Birds of prey are explicitly forbidden. The clean animals, the permissible ones, are herbivores. Cattle, sheep, goats, certain birds, certain fish. In Islamic dietary law, halal, the restrictions are similar. Animals with fangs or talons are forbidden. This again excludes carnivores. The emphasis is on herbivorous mammals and certain fish and birds. These laws aren't arbitrary. They encode practical wisdom. The animals that are forbidden are often those that pose health risks, whether from parasites, disease, or, as we've discussed, bioaccumulation of toxins. The animals that are permitted are those that have proven safe and practical to raise and eat. Now, did the ancient authors of these laws understand bioaccumulation or energy efficiency in modern scientific terms? Of course not. But they understood practical outcomes. They observed what worked and what didn't. They noticed patterns. People who ate certain animals got sick more often. Certain animals were harder to raise. Certain flesh simply tasted bad or caused problems. These observations were encoded into religious law, given divine authority, and passed down through generations. The explanation might have been framed in terms of cleanliness, of purity, of honoring God's commandments, but the underlying logic was practical. These laws help communities avoid foods that were risky or impractical. The cultural evolution beyond specific religious laws, cultural taboos and preferences evolved around food. In many societies, eating predators became simply unthinkable, not because of law, but because of custom. Part of this might have been association. Predators were feared and respected. They were competitors, threats to livestock and sometimes to people. They were hunted to protect herds, but not typically eaten. This treatment, different from prey animals, became culturally embedded. In some cultures, predators took on spiritual significance. Bears, for instance, were revered in many Northern European and North American indigenous traditions. Killing a bear might be a significant event, treated with ritual and respect, but eating it was done sparingly or with specific preparation, not as routine food. Wolves were seen as symbols of wildness, danger, cunning. Lions became emblems of royalty. Tigers were feared and admired. These animals occupied a different category in the human imagination than cattle or pigs. They weren't food. They were something else. Symbols, threats, worthy, opponents, spiritual beings. This cultural elevation might seem arbitrary, but it served a purpose. It reinforced the boundary between livestock and wild predators. It helped ensure that people didn't waste effort trying to farm the unfarmable or eat the inedible. The modern persistence today, we have technology that ancient farmers couldn't dream of. We can raise animals in climate-controlled facilities. We can manufacture feed. We can transport food across oceans. We can, in theory, overcome many of the practical barriers that made carnivore farming impossible in the past. And yet, we still don't farm carnivores for meat. Why? Because despite all our technology, the fundamental problems remain. The energy inefficiency is still there. The bioaccumulation risk is still there, arguably worse than ever given modern pollution. The taste issue hasn't changed. And culturally, we have 10,000 years of tradition saying, don't eat predators. There are some edge cases in the modern world. Crocodile farms exist in some places, raising crocodiles for meat and leather. But crocodiles are reptiles, which have different metabolisms than mammals. They can go long periods without eating. They grow relatively quickly, and they're not at the top of terrestrial food chains in the same way that a lion or bear is. Some exotic meat markets exist, catering to adventurous eaters or people seeking traditional medicines. But these are niche markets, not mainstream food production. The vast majority of meat consumed globally still comes from the same animals our ancestors domesticated thousands of years ago: cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep. The lab-grown exception, there's one modern development that might change the calculation. Lab-grown meat. Cultured meat, grown from animal cells in bioreactors, could theoretically produce carnivore flesh without the need to raise carnivore animals. You could, in principle, culture lion cells and grow lion meat without feeding a lion anything. The cells would be fed a nutrient solution, bypassing all the energy inefficiency of trophic levels. There'd be no bioaccumulation because the cells were never part of a whole animal living in a contaminated ecosystem. You could control the fat content, the texture, potentially even the flavor. Will this happen? Will lab-grown lion steaks appear in supermarkets? Probably not, at least not in the near future. Because even if you could produce it, who would buy it? There's no culinary tradition around carnivore meat. No one knows how it should be prepared or what it should taste like. There's no cultural desire for it. Lab-grown meat technology is focusing on producing familiar products. Beef, chicken, pork, things people already want to eat. Expanding into exotic or carnivorous species would require creating demand where none exists. And given all the cultural, historical, and practical reasons we've discussed, that demand is unlikely to materialize. Exceptions that prove the rule. Throughout this exploration, we've encountered exceptions. Carnivorous fish, Arctic peoples eating seals and polar bears, archaeological evidence of Neanderthals occasionally eating bear, modern exotic meat markets. These exceptions are instructive because they highlight the specific circumstances under which humans will eat carnivores. Usually, it's necessity. You're in an environment where herbivores are scarce, so you eat what's available. Or it's fish, which due to their unique physiology and flavor profile are treated differently despite being carnivorous. Or it's occasional, perhaps ritualistic, not a dietary staple. Archaeological evidence shows that when Neanderthals hunted cave bears, for instance, this appears to have been targeted and opportunistic rather than routine. The cut marks, burn patterns, and tooth marks on bear bones from sites like Rio Secco Cave and Fumane Cave in Italy suggest they did consume the meat, but the relatively low proportion of bear remains compared to herbivore prey indicates this wasn't standard practice. Even in cultures where carnivore consumption is more common, it's rarely the primary protein source. It's supplemental, special, or confined to specific parts of the animal that may be less affected by the concerns we've discussed. So the exceptions reinforce the pattern. Under normal circumstances, with access to herbivores and omnivores, humans don't eat carnivores. Only when circumstances are unusual, when alternatives are limited, when cultural or practical necessity demands it, do we turn to predator meat. The synthesis. Let's bring it all together. Why don't humans eat carnivores? First, energy efficiency. Carnivores are expensive to raise because they require feeding with meat, which itself requires raising prey animals. Each step up the food chain loses 90% of the energy. Farming carnivores for food is economically nonsensical. Second, bioaccumulation. Toxins, both natural and industrial, concentrate in carnivore tissues. Eating carnivores puts you at risk of mercury, PCBs, and other contaminants that have magnified through the food chain. Third, taste and texture. Carnivore meat tends to be tough, lean, and strongly flavored. Our evolved preferences favor the tender, fatty, mildly flavored meat of herbivores. Fourth, domestication impracticality. Carnivores are harder to contain, harder to breed, more dangerous to manage, and require food sources that make farming them prohibitively difficult. Fifth, cultural and religious tradition. 10,000 years of agricultural practice have created deep cultural preferences and religious laws that forbid or discourage carnivore consumption. Sixth, simple availability and preference. We have abundant sources of good meat from herbivores. Why bother with difficult, risky, bad-tasting alternatives? These reasons aren't independent. They reinforce each other. The energy inefficiency made farming carnivores impossible, which meant no cultural tradition developed around eating them, which meant religious laws could easily forbid them, which reinforced the cultural aversion. The bioaccumulation risk, even when not fully understood, manifested as health problems that got associated with carnivore consumption, furthering the taboo. The poor taste meant there was no incentive to overcome the other barriers. It's a perfect storm of factors, each individually powerful, all working in concert to create a nearly universal human pattern. We don't eat the predators. What this tells us about being human. This isn't just about diet. It's about human nature, about how we adapt to constraints, about how we learn and transmit knowledge across generations. Humans are remarkably flexible omnivores. We can eat an extraordinary range of foods. We've colonized nearly every ecosystem on Earth, from the Arctic to tropical rainforests, from coastal regions to high mountains. In each environment, we've figured out what to eat. We've learned what's safe, what's nutritious, what's practical. The avoidance of carnivore meat is one piece of that learning. Is practical wisdom, acquired through millennia of experience, encoded in culture, validated by religion, and now explained by science. It shows that human food choices aren't random. They're not purely cultural in the sense of being arbitrary. They're shaped by deep ecological and biological realities. Culture reflects and responds to those realities, even when the people carrying that culture don't consciously understand the underlying reasons. It also shows the power of agriculture to shape human societies. The decision to farm herbivores wasn't just about food. It was about settling down, building permanent communities, developing surplus, supporting non-farming specialists like craftspeople and priests and soldiers. Civilization, as we know it, rested on the foundation of domesticated herbivores. If humans had tried to farm carnivores instead, it wouldn't have worked. Civilization might have taken a very different path, or perhaps not developed at all in the same way. The future. Will this pattern continue? Almost certainly. Despite all our technological advancement, the fundamental reasons for avoiding carnivore meat remain valid. The energy inefficiency can't be engineered away as long as we're talking about raising whole animals. the bioaccumulation gets worse, not better, as we pollute the environment further. Taste preferences are deeply ingrained. Even in a future with lab-grown meat, where the practical barriers could theoretically be overcome, cultural preferences will likely persist. Humans eat what they know, what their parents ate, what their culture tells them is food. Breaking that pattern requires significant motivation, and there's no motivation to start eating carnivore meat when perfectly good alternatives exist. Perhaps far in the future, in off-world colonies where ecosystems are being engineered from scratch, different patterns might emerge. Perhaps in post-scarcity societies with radical new technologies, food choices will be completely divorced from the constraints that shape them on Earth. But for now, for the foreseeable future, the pattern holds. Walk into any grocery store, any restaurant, any farm, anywhere in the world, and you'll see the same thing our ancestors would have seen had they lived long enough to visit: cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, herbivores and omnivores, the animals that work, that make sense, that feed civilization. Carnivores will remain in zoos, in the wild, in our imaginations as symbols and characters, but not on our plates. Because 10,000 years of human experience, validated by modern science, all point to the same conclusion. It's just not a good idea. The quiet wisdom. There's something profound about this, about how practical reality shapes culture, about how culture preserves wisdom even when the original reasons are forgotten, about how science can later come along and explain what people already knew. Our ancestors didn't need equations about trophic energy transfer to know that feeding a carnivore was wasteful. They didn't need mass spectrometers to measure mercury to know that predator meat could make you sick. They didn't need food science research to know that it didn't taste as good. They just tried it, observed the results, and adjusted their practices accordingly. This is human intelligence in action. Not abstract reasoning, though we're capable of that, but practical, adaptive learning. Paying attention to what works, remembering it, passing it on. Building a body of knowledge that becomes tradition, that becomes culture, that becomes who we are. When you sit down to a meal of beef or chicken or pork, you're not just eating meat, you're participating in 10,000 years of accumulated human wisdom. You're eating foods that have been tested, refined, improved. Foods that work in every sense of the word, ecologically, nutritionally, culturally. And when you don't eat lion or wolf or bear, you're also participating in that wisdom, in the knowledge that some paths don't lead anywhere useful, that some experiments fail, that constraints are real, and working within them rather than against them is often the wisest course, the final answer. So why don't humans eat carnivorous animals? Because energy flows upward through food chains, and each step loses 90%. Because toxins flow upward too, and each step concentrates them. Because muscle built for predation is different from muscle built for grazing. Because farming carnivores is impractical and dangerous. Because 10,000 years of agriculture focused on herbivores for good reasons. Because culture and religion encoded these good reasons into tradition and law. Because we have better options. Because it doesn't make sense, didn't make sense. And barring radical changes in our circumstances or technology never will make sense. The answer isn't simple because reality isn't simple. Multiple factors interlock, each reinforcing the others. But together, they create a pattern so strong, so universal, that it's one of the defining features of human food systems across all cultures and all of recorded history. We don't eat carnivores because we're human, and humans are adaptive, practical, learning creatures who figured out long ago that some foods work and some don't. Carnivore meat doesn't work, so we don't eat it. It's as simple and as complex as that. Closing thoughts. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this the next time you eat. Think about the invisible structures shaping your choices, the ecology, the chemistry, the biology, the history, all working together, all pointing in the same direction. Think about the fact that something as simple as what's on your plate connects you to 10,000 years of human experience, to the physics of energy transfer, to the chemistry of contamination, to the biology of muscle tissue, to the cultural evolution of dietary laws. You are not separate from this deep history. You are part of it. Your taste preferences, evolved over millions of years, guide you toward foods that work. Your culture, shaped over thousands of years, reinforces those preferences. Your personal choices, made daily, participate in patterns that stretch back to the dawn of agriculture. And somewhere out there, a lion stalks through tall grass, hunting. A wolf howls at the moon. A bear forages in the forest. They live their lives, carnivores doing what carnivores do, eating what carnivores eat. And we, humans, omnivores with options, we eat what we've always eaten. Cattle and pigs and chickens. The foods that build civilization. The foods that make sense. Not carnivores. Never carnivores. Because we learned better long ago. And that lesson stuck. Sleep well, knowing that even your most basic choices are rooted in deep wisdom. And if this helped you understand something new about the world, about food, about the invisible forces that shape our lives, please like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strange and comforting to know we're all here together, learning the same old truths in new ways. The world is full of patterns if you know where to look. This is just one of them, but it's a good one, a true one, a useful one. Rest now, and tomorrow, when you eat, you'll understand a little more about why you eat what you eat, and why some things, despite being theoretically edible, remain off the menu, not by accident, not by whim, but by the accumulated wisdom of our entire species, working out what works and what doesn't, one meal at a time, across 10,000 years. Good night.